Coming up, the New York Football Giants gave the fan base a dose of disgusting Thanksgiving loss. Plus, we look at the weekend. How'd the rest of the NFL do? Are the key teams ahead of Big Blue in Tankathon rankings doing justice? Or are we staring down the barrel of being a middle of the top 10 pick? We'll break it all down. Coming up next. Yes, my friends, it's OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where you know that we are your host over here, Adam Armbrecht, over there, Andrew Makowitz. We're healthy, we're wealthy, we're wise. We're talking about Big Blue and what feels like eons ago that they lost on the Thanksgiving Day game to division rival Dallas Cowboys, but also all the implications of the final 5 weeks of the season, the coaching hot seats, the expectations, the injuries. Andy, how are we, sir, on a Monday?
Yeah, I'm good, Adam. You mentioned it. It feels like the Thursday game and getting in front of the table and carving the turkey was ages ago. And here we sit. After that, it was nice to have that Sunday off from the Giants, though. Like, we got the loss out of the way really early so you could sit and watch some of the games around the league. I know we're going to get into like how the board kind of fell and where the Giants stand, but it was fascinating to watch a couple of teams that we'll highlight later on. And like, the Giants are up against a few of them in terms of trying to get the best pick in the NFL draft. But off the top, obviously, we talk a little bit about the Giants-Cowboys. It was a matchup in futility, yet it was the fourth largest watched Thanksgiving game, I think, in history. And that just tells you how big the Cowboys and the Giants brands are when it comes to this. But, Adam, talk to me a little bit about the game on Thursday. Were you settled in? Did you have a nice plate of turkey and gravy and mashed potatoes in front of you? What was going on for you?
Yeah, I did it all, man. Yeah, I was all set up. You a little bit of cranberry sauce, a little bit of mashed potatoes, maybe some sweet potatoes. You do the whole fixins, and it's good. And every single bite tasted delicious because there was no concern about watching this game and wondering whether or not this team was going to do something that was going to show something that made you change your perspective on them. 27-20, they lose to the Dallas Cowboys. You go inside the box score. You had Tommy DeVito start the week prior. Then he has the shoulder injury. So it ends up being the number 2 quarterback that the team decided to go over top of to get to Tommy DeVito, Drew Lock, who starts this game. And he goes classic 21-32, 178 yards, 5.6 yards per pass, no touchdowns, an interception, which happened to also be a pick six, Andy, one that I assume your family was, I'm going to say balanced and nuanced in their reaction to, given that I've been to tailgates with your family, I've been inside Giant Stadium, and I know that they believe in nuance.
So Adam, the funny story is obviously, so I was the only one that thought the Bears had a chance to upset the Lions in the early game. So then all of a sudden that got me a little bit of credibility around the table. And I said, hey, everyone, listen, huddle in. I had some family members around me and I said, we obviously cannot bet against the Giants. Like, we cannot do that. That is not something I'm going to start doing on Thanksgiving. I just can't actively root for that loss and put money behind it, Adam. So instead, we pivot and we say, with Drew Lock starting, what are the odds that the Cowboys are going to score a defensive touchdown in this game? It has to be pretty decent. And so it was 10-1, and I convinced all of my family members to at least, responsively put down as much as they felt comfortable with. So when it happened, Adam, it was actually like one of those like, oh, no, what are you doing? Hold your head. And then everyone looked around and was like, wait a second. Like, Drew Lock's futility and this team's futility actually won me money. So everyone was very excited. And it felt like it was a little, check in the box of, what does Drew Lock do? He looks a little bewildered. He makes mistakes. And it happened exactly how I thought it would, which is like, he kind of gets a tip pass and then someone runs it back for a touchdown. It was perfect. It was literally perfect, Adam.
Well, what does Drew Lock do? He makes people money. That's what he does, right? Including himself, $5 million contract and making his first start of the season. So good news for the Makowitz household. On the other side of it, you're talking about the game, which finishes with the Giants within 7, but ultimately this game was not that close. And the only question that I really had coming out of it is from the perspective of where do we sit with the coach and how do we feel about the GM? What did you think coming out of that game against that team? Because, oh, by the way, it did help that the Dallas Cowboys winning that game, and I think it's different for them and what their expectations were coming this season, the talent they currently have on the roster, losing their starting quarterback. But they are now 13th in terms of Tankathon's draft rankings, now at 5-7. They could have been a 4-8 team. The Giants could have been 3-9, and it would look a little bit different. So you help yourself, so to speak. Do you feel any different about Brian Dable and about the coaching staff after that game? Are you willing to just say, well, what are you supposed to learn when it's Drew Lock and there are injuries? Because I can already feel like there's this narrative starting to build when players go down, which we'll talk about, that'll be what you reflect back on at the end of the year. Not, not you, the royal we. That, oh, well, yeah, remember though they lost the player X, player Y, Daniel Jones wasn't good enough, all these things. And I just think at some point we have to say, yeah, you are what your record is, and here we are, a team that's 2-10.
Yeah, listen, I kind of felt like it didn't change my opinion on anything. The only thing that it slightly maybe changed for me is just Shane Bowen and the defense for me was the thing that I immediately thought about is like, yes, this offense isn't good enough. We're missing a left tackle. We're missing a right tackle. We're missing a whole host of weapons. Obviously, our QB1 didn't work out. It's going to be a tough go to be able to move the ball on offense, even against
Right.
Cowboys defense that historically has been terrible against the run for this season. But I look at the defense. I mean, Rico Dowdle had his first 100-yard game. The Giants couldn't stop the run. That's been the big Achilles heel of the Giants so far this season is not having some kind of defensive tackle next to Dexter Lawrence that can actually stop the run and get people in passing situations, uncomfortable situations. And Adam,
Sure.
The crazy part is we can't stop the run and we don't have a number one cornerback. I don't know if we have a number two cornerback on our roster. So teams have the ability to throw the ball all over us if we were to get stops in the run. But
Sure.
we're not making teams multi-dimensional. We're making teams multi-dimensional, not just singular in their focus against our defense. So for me, I'm looking at it and saying, most likely out of all of this, I think this is a one and done for Shane Bowen as the defensive coordinator for the Giants.
Mhm.
And he might be a nice guy and it might work out. And he had great run defenses in Tennessee. It's clearly not working here with the personnel that we have. And his scheme just is not working. So for me, I don't know, like, regardless if we get rid of the head coach and the GM, I just think there has to be a new defensive coordinator, regardless of the higher up decisions.
Hey, it's always good, man. 2 years ago, you have Wink Martindale. He was a well-regarded coach around the NFL. Now he's off in college, and we understand maybe he rubbed some people the wrong way, but you let go of him. You don't get your number one defensive coordinator choice. You end up settling on Shane Bowen, and then you turn around now, and it feels like, remember, he's the guy that said, if you get Brian Burns, you're all set. You're not going to be bothered by that. No other big acquisition. Said, no, I will be smitten as a kitten if I get this guy there with Kayvon Thibodeau and Dexter Lawrence. And while there were moments and there were flashes over the early part of the season, there certainly has not been the same level of impact. We understand there has been injuries, but it just doesn't feel like what he represented with the Tennessee Titans has necessarily translated to having that be a part of the core identity of this defense. And oh, by the way, this also is my last note of this Cowboys game, was one where CeeDee Lamb was dropping things left, right, and center. Like when you go into a game and you don't have much of a secondary and you're worried about some of those key matchups and you turn around and CeeDee Lamb gets 2 catches for 39 yards on 6 targets. And again, I think the other 4 were drops. Even when you think things could break a way for your team, they do not. And again, ultimately, doesn't matter because we're not really worried about wins here. We are worried about individual performances. There were a lot of injuries that came out of this. So I want to turn our attention over to injuries, maybe any final takeaways, and obviously overall this weekend, what we got from the NFL.
Yeah, last thing I wanted to point out, especially on that front, is the turnovers. Like, this is such a different scheme than what Wink Martindale did, which is high pressure, force people to make decisions, but could get burned deep. This is death by 1,000 paper cuts, and the other team is not really stressed out at all. Adam, the Giants haven't had an interception in 11 straight games. It's a franchise record. It's a record around the league in futility. The Giants have
how many
one
does Xavier
interception.
McKinney have? Just want to
What happened?
base on that. Just want to touch base on how many Xavier McKinney has right now. Just to.
Oh yeah, I think he has 7 at this point. And I think Leonard Williams also has the same amount of interceptions. He has more pick sixes than the Giants do for
That's
sure
right.
this season. But it's just a tough go. The offense isn't creating. The defense isn't creating the turnovers that they need to. They're not really, recently creating the pressures that they need. For me, it was window dressing the way the offense, scored a couple of points in the fourth quarter, down 3 scores. There's nothing good going on. I'm starting to feel more and more like the momentum is going to be around a full changeover. This whole weird thing of like keeping a coach and keeping a GM, but drafting a new guy, but then firing them. Like, I think you and I both agree it is a multi-year commitment from here on out if you stick with Brian Daboll and Joe Schoen, or else you clearly are showing that you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah, and the two-tier process of it, of saying either they're all together or they're separate, and what would that look like? You can't fire the GM, I don't believe, and then still keep the head coach. That would feel weird, even if Joe Schoen deserves to be fired. We don't, whether or not that's the case. Firing the head coach is possible, but then you leave the GM to maybe draft the next head coach and hire the next head coach and then draft the next quarterback. And if that doesn't work out, and then you want to fire the GM after 1 year, what do you do with the head coach that you just hired? The carousel, the chasing of the proverbial tail continues for the New York Football Giants. Let's talk about the weekend, though. Tankathon has a very interesting team in the top of the draft that I want to get to, along with all the other results from the weekend and what it meant for Big Blue. We'll do that here in just one moment. Reminder, as we continue today's One Giant podcast, the episode is brought to you by Personam. Personam is an AI threat detection search engine that gives you insights into your network security that other platforms simply cannot do. You can find more at personam.ai. That's PERSONAM.ai. Check it out today and secure your network. Now, when we talk about the weekend that was, I'm going to go over to Tankathon here real quick, because you mentioned there in the top, Giants are now third. You have Jacksonville, you have Las Vegas, brutal, incredibly dirty hit, player familiar with dirty plays in the Jacksonville game. So as a byproduct, we may be talking about Jacksonville being without Trevor Lawrence for the remainder of the season. The Vegas Raiders are just a bad football team right now. Maybe Antonio Pierce is the next defensive coordinator for the New York Football Giants. Let's have that conversation. But down the road there's no real surprising teams inside of Tankathon, except for when you get to the Cincinnati Bengals, who are a 4-8 team, who cannot seem to figure it out, while simultaneously having what would be the leading MVP candidate in Joe Burrow, if not for the fact that they are 4-8, and they have their number one wide receiver in Jamar Chase, and they have Chase Brown, who I have on my fantasy team and continues to crush all season long. It is a fascinating reminder that when you are a bad team and you think about, oh, well, we'll just do this, we'll just do that, we'll just be bad, we'll just get the quarterback. Even when you have those things, coaching matters, the rest of personnel matters, roster construction matters. And Cincinnati just feels like the poster child for, you can think you have it all and still be really far away from having it all.
Yeah, even having a franchise quarterback, as you mentioned, that is a game changer. He's probably, in my opinion, a top 5 QB in the NFL. And yet they still have all of these problems. They have 2 potential number 1 wide receivers. They have an electric running back, and they're putting up 30-something points a game at him, and they basically are horrific on defense. And while the Giants couldn't take advantage of it, other teams are clearly taking advantage of it, against Cincinnati. And so it is a fascinating one to think about, where their offense is one of the top 3 or 4 offenses in the league, and yet they are as bad as their record indicates. You mentioned the Jaguars being number 1, and I find this one fascinating for a whole host of reasons. Obviously, the Giants are tied in record. The reason why the Jaguars have the number 1 pick is because of strength of schedule. The easier your schedule, the worse your record shows when you're tied with someone else. And
the Giants, by the way, are nowhere near. Like, they are far and away. I know you're going to go into Jacksonville and Vegas 529, but nobody else. Everyone else is in the 4s in terms of it, or low 5s in terms of strength of schedule. So Giants cannot be on par here down the stretch if they want to have the number 1 pick.
Yeah, the tie is most likely going to go to all of these other teams, especially when you look at the schedules, Adam. And that's what I was just going to do with you now is, who knows if Trevor Lawrence is going to be out. Mac Jones is at least a competent, serviceable backup in the NFL. I think you probably would agree. You'd probably rather have him over Drew Lock if you're thinking about like the pecking order of who has run offenses, who's made a Pro Bowl before, things like that. But the Jaguars' schedule is fascinating to me. So the Jaguars have the worst schedule. I mean, the worst record in the league. Adam, here are their final remaining 5 games: the Titans, the Jets, the Raiders, the Titans again, and the Colts. That's who the Jaguars play, which is the easiest schedule in the NFL. And so, like, you're never going to get the strength of schedule over the Jaguars, right? So that means the Jaguars need to win a couple of those games, and you need to be able to make sure that you don't win more than 1 game. And, like, who knows? They're a very bad team, but the fact that they play the Raiders in there, and the Raiders are number 2, one of those teams has to win that football game, presumably, which will help the Giants. But I just think the Jaguar situation is fascinating.
Yeah, and I mean, I haven't looked at the other schedules for these teams. You mentioned Tennessee Titans twice, and you mentioned the New York Jets. Well, the Jets have a 505 strength of schedule. The Giants is 541. So they have the lesser there, so they would be above them as well. The Tennessee Titans have a 510 strength of schedule. So to your point, well, it's Jacksonville. Maybe they'll play Tennessee. Maybe they'll win one game. Maybe they'll lose one game. They split that series. You're talking about, well, what about Tennessee? And who are they going to be playing down the stretch? They're a 3-win team. The Jets are a 3-win team right now. So on the one hand, listen, what you want is to have Jacksonville win a game here because they are ahead of the Giants right now in terms of the draft order, as is Vegas. The flip side of that is if they win some of the games, the teams they're playing are right there behind the New York Football Giants. So this is where I always come back to. And it's not about we're in a place where you want the Giants while you root for them to do well on Sundays. If they lose, you're not remotely upset by it. But you can't just tank to the bottom. The variables are too much. The Jacksonville Jaguars want to be a good team this year, and they are in a position to draft first overall. The Vegas Raiders, I think, wanted to be competitive this year, but they need that quarterback. And that's the one difference here, I think, between Jacksonville, at least pre Trevor Lawrence injury versus now, right? So Vegas, even though they've been playing Aiden O'Connell, he looked pretty good over the weekend. So maybe they feel like they have something more. My suspicion is they want to get one of those top quarterbacks, right? Jacksonville may not, but instead of it being Trevor Lawrence comes back from injury and you can get some feel-good vibes by winning some games down the stretch and say, we're not as bad as our record was. Gosh, so close in so many instances. If Lawrence isn't going to play the rest of the year or even for the next few weeks, you are having a different discussion because it's always the PR battle. Now you can say, yeah, it was a rough season. Trevor dealt with a lot of injuries, but we got ourselves a number one cornerback that we wanted to go get, right? Or we're able to trade down out of that top spot and get us something. The benefit, I think, to me around the Jaguars being there is that they will be open for trade business, I think, at the top of the draft. That plays into the Giants' advantage. When it comes to the Raiders, not so much. When it comes to New England, yes, we can dance with that if it flip-flops. Carolina, they're in an interesting spot with Bryce Young right now. So you go through it, and you have to look at every one of these teams and say, how willing are they going to be to play in terms of the Giants being able to move up the board if they finish a little bit lower? I don't know about the Tennessee Titans. Will Levis has a handful of games against bad teams down the stretch of the season. Maybe they turn the corner on that as well. New York Jets are in that mix too. So that's I think, the most important thing here. It's about who do they have at their quarterback position? How flexible are they at the top of the draft? And those are the only teams I want to be ahead of us are the ones that I think would at least pick up the phone if the Giants wanted to go get their guy and needed someone to trade with.
Yeah, I mean, listen, that's the whole song and dance about this is what teams are sold on their quarterback, what teams are looking for a quarterback. The Giants have a lot of work to do. These next 5 games are going to be critical and pivotal for what happens for the rest of the season for the Giants.
At the end of the day, when it comes to the schedule, it is what it is to me. And the Giants, I don't know. I don't know if they did everything possible to lose that game on Sunday strategically. Maybe they could have started Boyle instead. That might have been, the home run hitting strategy. But they got that loss. And it's not like you look at any game on the schedule and think anything other than even if the Giants were desperately trying to win. I don't know if they're capable of that. Anything else jump out for you for Sunday before we talk about injuries for the Giants down the stretch here and really peeling away this onion and whether or not you and I sit here today and say, unless they're going to win more football games, I cannot see a world where we get back Ryan Dable and maybe even potentially Joe Shane as well. Let's tap into that after closing thoughts from the weekend. Anything else jump out?
Very, very simple thing is the Giants really didn't have the board break very well in terms of the games on Sunday. Las Vegas had a chance to go down the field and kick a field goal against the Chiefs. That would have been an enormous win for the Giants. The Carolina Panthers had a chance as well to go into the end zone or kick a field goal in overtime. They fumbled the ball just like the Raiders fumbled the ball. That's what bad teams do, though, Adam. So you can't really fault the fact that happens. But man, you look around. New England lost a heartbreaker with the Colts going for 2. Carolina lost a fumble. Vegas lost it. It felt like there were opportunities for those teams to steal a win. Would have helped the Giants. Unfortunately, it didn't. But listen, you can only control what you can control. The Giants hopefully will lose out from here on out.
All right, last notes for me here coming back in just one moment, talking about expectations down the stretch of this season before we continue to look at and start to highlight some of these draft picks as we work our way through the last handful of games of the year. All right, so the Giants lose on Thursday. A lot of teams, as you mentioned, their win on Sunday that hurt the Giants in terms of Tankathon and where they're standing right now. Notable to me, 2 teams have already clinched in the AFC, the Chiefs and the Bills, as far as being in the playoff picture. Seeding will obviously play itself out over the remainder of the year. Nothing has been decided in terms of clinched in the NFC. If you want a silver line to a bad year, I'll let you know right now that the wild cards as they currently stand are 10-2 Vikings, 9-3 Packers, and the 8-5 Commanders who won over the weekend. It is a really congested NFC picture right now when it comes to the playoffs. So whatever your optimism level was around the Giants, take solace in the fact that you were never going to be playing in these games against these teams and finding a way to probably have to get to 10 wins, 11 wins potentially. Like the remainder of this season in the NFC specifically is going to be a bloodbath for teams that are right now thinking, look what we've accomplished this year, to son of a gun, we're a piece away, one moment lost. And I look just quickly at that Commanders win, the Buccaneers, like the two teams being built differently and having different expectations coming into the season. All of a sudden, the Commanders are riding hot right now, and Daniels is going to lead them potentially to a rookie season playoff appearance.
Yeah, it's also what I'm thinking about is I go back to the original Washington Commanders game where the Giants were still a relevant team. They were right around 500. Malik Neighbors drops a pass. The coaching staff and GM don't have a backup kicker, and we got very upset about it. And now, if you look at it in grand scheme of things, would you want the Giants to have 3 wins and the Commanders to have 1 less win? Like what ultimately, when you look back in hindsight, would that have done for the Giants? In fact, that might have been a blessing in disguise for the Giants to lose that game, put the
What would it
division
have
even
done?
further.
Andy, what would it have done? We'd be sitting here right now and we'd be talking about the Giants at 3-9 and saying they're probably picking 7th or 8th overall in the draft right now. And they're in this weird mush with teams like the Saints and Cleveland and everybody else. And that strength of schedule would be doing them damage. So yeah, the difference between having a kicker and being a functional organization probably costs you about 5 to 6 positions inside of the draft class. If this team, we're going to talk about it, plenty of time to discuss it. But right now, as it stands, you lose that game. You see where everything is. You know the expectations potentially to be able to go there. This week, by the way, I want to talk about a GM tandem that I think is interesting and intriguing for the Giants, were they to pivot off of it. But we'll keep doing this check-in every single week. Here on Monday, December 2nd, how do you feel about the Shane Dable ticket? Who's staying? Who's going for you in this moment?
Well, I think it's going to be very interesting, Adam. I just wanted to highlight, obviously, Dexter Lawrence had a really terrible
Oh, yeah.
injury.
Sorry.
It
Yeah.
sounds
The
like
injuries,
he's going to be out
obviously.
for
We
the
can do those
season.
too. Yeah.
Sounds like Theo Johnson had another injury. He's going to be out for the season, which, as long as it's not like past this season, as long as it's only like a multi-week injury, this might be the best thing for the Giants, is to shut down some of your bigger, talented playmakers on offense and defense. I think it's going to clear things up for the Giants. I think we're going to see the run game is going to, the opposition run game and our run defense is going to be even more suspect with no Dexter Lawrence. We don't, we claimed Greg Dulcich off of the Broncos waiver.
Oh, my
We
God.
have a
Who
couple of
cares?
different things that are going to happen. But when you talk about like what to expect, I think the Giants are going to be terrible. I don't know if there's anything over the next 5 games that's going to change my mind in terms of how I feel about this team. You want them to lose. You need them to lose. Don't let that color whether or not this is the right tandem to bring us out of this, even if you think that they are culpable in the reason why we're in this mess in the first place.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to watch. You mentioned some of those things, just like we talked about before with Trevor Lawrence going down. Oh, does that give the Jaguars a little bit of cover in terms of how they look at their season? I really hope, whatever the choice is, that the influence is not about, well, we lost Kayvon Thibodeau for a few weeks. Oh, Dexter Lawrence at the end of the year. Oh, Theo Johnson. All these things. Listen, they're all real and they all happened. And nevertheless, you were already losing games before that. You were already benching the franchise quarterback, allegedly, that you had paid big money to. You were already demoting him to a 4th string status before releasing him and all these things. You already didn't make the signing decisions that maybe would have helped your team be stronger overall. So I don't want the cloud of ambiguity and injury to take away just real evaluation. And that doesn't mean that I have a concrete take on if I think Joe Shane should stay or go, or if Brian Dable should stay or go. But these last handful of games are going to be very telling, and I find it very hard for this team to be a 2 or 3 win roster and have Brian Dable at a minimum maintain that. We'll come back, though. We'll come back all week, baby, because we got things to talk about. I have a veteran GM head coach tandem to talk about. We'll see whether or not that piques Andy's interest. Be sure to stay tuned in the middle of the week for that, as well as looking around the draft and some players that we have our eyes on if the Giants are drafting in and around that top 5 to 10 area. But until next time, you get us over on YouTube at One Giant Podcast on your podcast feeds. Please subscribe, leave a glowing review wherever possible, and get us over on X at Adam Armbrecht, at AMAC214, and at One Giant Podcast. Until the next time, until the best times. As Andrew Macklitz would want, need, and demand the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.